My name is Charlie Mathews, and I'm here today with Mlungisi Larry Khumalo-McArthur, and we're talking about Black Lives Matter. We're talking about how the media represents blackness, fragile whiteness, and transformation in the advertising industry. Larry, you've been in the communications sector for quite a while now. Give us the who-ness of Larry, kind of the experiences you've had in the industry, and what has informed your identity.
Thanks for this opportunity to chat. It's really cool, and I mean that first question: how much time do we have? So maybe let's kick off with how I ended up in PR. I mean, I'm a Black Zimbabwean boy. I was born in Bulawayo 35 years ago, which was then like born free Zimbabwe, post-colonial Zimbabwe, kind of at the infancy of this Zimbabwe project. And then things were pretty okay, with that country as it was coming out of colonialism. There was this grand narrative around this Zimbabwean identity that was true to the various tribes that lived there. But around about the time I was born, I'm in Ndebele, there was a genocide that Shona people kind of meted out on Ndebele people. So I think as I was coming of age, a lot of the hangover from that genocide kind of lingers around the identity of a lot of Ndebele people. We kind of felt for a long time, and I think they still feel that, we felt like we were on the margins a little bit, a bit of a second-classness that comes with being Ndebele in that country. But, normal childhood, sort of working class family, and then my mother's generation kind of became lower middle class to middle class, with college degrees and professional jobs, and moving out of home and moving out of the township into medium density suburbs and sending us to private schools so we could get better education. And then I found myself in Johannesburg about 13 years ago to take a second stab at studying. So sometime in my past, I wanted to be an IT guy. And so I studied IT for a while, and I worked as an IT consultant for a while, and discovered the joy of storytelling when I was working with this NGO in Zimbabwe, women's NGO called Fulimkondo. And discovered storytelling, and I discovered I quite liked it, and I had this natural affinity to it. And so I just Googled what it is that one would study if one wants to be in the middle of storytelling and civil society. And I ended up at Monash University studying international relations and media relations. And then I fell in love while I was here with a Scottish man who was born here in South Africa, and decided to stay here. And been working in South Africa. I've been working across Southern Africa actually for the last 12 years in PR, doing mostly corporate communications, like you said, in the energy sector, mobility, as well as travel and tourism and financial services. So, I mean, that's kind of like a very basic thing. Started in 1985, and here we are today in 2020. But yeah, I mean, I've had a very interesting ride working in marketing here in Johannesburg mostly. And it's coincided with like this idea of learning to be Black, because in Zimbabwe, you're not Black, you're Zimbabwean. But moving to South Africa, I learned that I was Black, and I kind of learned that within the first 2 weeks of living in the West Rand, which is where I lived when I went to university. I rented an apartment in a complex, and one of the tenants in that complex saw me walking to school and assumed that I was a gardener, and basically asked me if I had time to come and tend to their little garden. I didn't get it at first, and I kind of brushed it away, but I thought about it a little more, and I kind of got the fact that they thought I was a gardener because I'm black. And that kind of thinking just opened my eyes to a lot of the way I was being treated in various spaces. And this is not to say there was no racism in Zimbabwe, there certainly was. But I think the visceral nature of it here and how it's just so close to the surface is kind of what hit me hard. And then I just started reading because, you know, that's that's what one does when they don't know. So I started reading, and over time have really gotten a better understanding of body politics in highly racialized spaces like we have in this country, and the expected place of bodies like mine, and the militancy of being a happy black body, and the militance of being, you know, a successful black body in a space that always tries to plunder. So it's been a hell of a journey.
So we're talking transformation in the communication sector, and you've worked for many, many, many years in the communication sector. What does it feel like to experience that and then to kind of go into the workplace and to see perhaps, I mean, have you been in workplaces that haven't been diverse? What has that experience been like for you? What has it been like to bump up against whiteness? Or what is whiteness like for you? And is the industry transformed? I mean, we're talking transformation here.
To answer that plainly, the industry is not transformed at all. Yeah. And it's not just marketing, it's a lot more than industries, but I can speak easily to marketing because that's where I've worked in. I mean, I think that the place that the world finds itself in at the moment is a highly charged space socially, because there's a lot of confrontation that is happening. And this is not to say it hasn't happened before, but I think there has been some listening happening at least, which is why we're having this global movement right now. And I over time, I mean, as I said, I've been reading and I've been learning and I've been getting a clearer understanding of the dynamics of race within the space. And I have come to a conclusion that I think generally describes my full-on experience, which is that in marketing, and I guess in many other sectors that are not transformed, like there is a killing of Black people every day. Yeah. It's just not in the visceral sense of George Floyd having a knee on his neck, but the plunder is gradual and it is violent, and it destroys Black bodies in the most fundamental of ways on a daily basis. And it starts from something as simple as, you know, not being listened to in a boardroom, all the way to having to explain to a colleague why all lives matter is a violent statement at a time like this, to fronting, being an only Black face that is used essentially to win business or to show some idea of transformation. Like it's so many ways that the racist microaggressions are really violent and plunder Black bodies on a daily basis. And when I started off working in marketing, I think as a Black child, you're kind of taught to be respectful, and you walk into corporate, and corporate makes you, for instance, call people who are your mother's age by name. And for me, that was the first thing that was really difficult to learn. It's like to call someone who's 50 years old Bill, or, you know, Elsaby. Like, it was really difficult to have to learn that. And then learning to speak to them not like they're your elder, but like they are your colleague. And it was just really a really hard transition to get through. And then after you get through that, you kind of have to fight for your voice. And you start off thinking, well, it's because I'm a junior. And so, nobody will give me the time of day, and I get that. That's fine. I'm going to learn. And then you learn and you learn and you improve. And then you realize it's not just because you're a junior, but it's also because you're Black. And then you realize more and more that a lot of the treatment you get from your colleagues or your bosses is largely because you're Black. And this is not to say that there has, not been any success stories or that people haven't triumphed. But I think the success stories are largely the exception. I mean, I always used to wonder, for instance, how do we in a majority Black country have commercials about airtime where Black women are dancing for airtime, or you have Black children dancing for surf or for pap or for sweets. It didn't make sense to me how in a country on the African continent we have advertising that essentially is derogatory to Black bodies, until I walked into brainstorming rooms, until I walked into rooms where people conceptualized, and I realized, oh, okay, so there are no Black voices in this space. There are Black faces in there, but there are no Black voices in this space because they're not listened to. And it doesn't matter how hard you try. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. I really think so. And a lot of that work starts from that everyday work of consciously confronting our own racial biases as people, but also there's grand broad strokes of work that need to be done in the industry, in the sense of having more Black people in leadership teams, having more Black people as shareholders, having more Black people in decision-making positions, where the running of accounts, the running of brands also includes voices from those people.
If you look at the ownership and the ownership ratios and that sort of thing, it shows that in marketing and in the communication sector, the transformation, the grand transformation experiment to degree has failed. And that hierarchical transformation, I mean, that's really what digital transformation is, isn't it? In a world where diversity equals intelligence, and where more diverse companies, the science shows, does so much better. What strikes me about your story is you tell me about kind of all the hard work you've done with identity, the reading, the intellectual growth, everything that you've done. And I get a sense of kind of white intellectual laziness, and kind of one gets a sense of not only that kind of a sense of ignorance, but with that kind of a sense of ego and narcissism.
It's so sad, but it's also really angering, because there's this assumption that Black bodies grow up knowing about James Baldwin and Steve Biko and Robert Sobukwe. We didn't grow up knowing these names. We had to go out and find the books and read. I think one of the biggest problems around how people view this idea of morality is because it doesn't make people warm in bed in the same way that money does, for example. So there's nothing else other than some kind of moral smugness or intellectual smugness that a lot of white people think comes from doing the work of reading and learning about the world around us. I don't think that a lot of them have realized the inherent value of what it means to really see the world for what it is, and to learn how to go about the world in a just way. And so until such a time that there is some kind of translation of that knowledge into money, I think will continue to be this laziness. And that's one of the huge drawbacks of having a capitalist society, is that everything is driven by money. So one white person who reads and does the work, at the end of the day, is just generally seem to be smug in their community around, oh, so you think you know better. When you really think about it, it's really disheartening. Because at the end of the day, it says that just transition and transformation is going to be dependent on the goodness of people. And for as long as people don't choose to be good, we will not get to a place where people make the effort to learn what it means to live in a world where Black people fear for their lives at every turn. And it's really hard to come to terms with that truth. And what's sad is that that's not the only truth about being aware of the world around us. There's so much more that you get from really understanding how people deal with you, or how people live with you, or how people around you live at all. There's so much more to be gained from it other than just feeling righteous. But a lot of white people don't see beyond that. And for a lot of Black people, the reason we choose to learn and we choose to read, and not all of us read and learn, by the way, but for those of us that do, the reason we do that is because our life depends on understanding these dynamics. Like literally, it could be a matter of life and death. Unless you understand that a policeman has some monopoly of violence in an engagement with them, unless you really get that monopoly, you're probably going to die at their hands. And the other end of that stick is you let them take the position of this, violent enforcer, and you lose your dignity for, 3-4 hours, and maybe it haunts you for the rest of your life, but you get extra years to live with people who love you and friends who love you.
How do we go forward? I live in Cape Town. The whole city is kind of cleaved into whiteness and blackness by geography. And how you ask yourself the question then, how can whiteness learn anything if it's locked away in enclaves? What change is going to come about then? And what change is going to come about if our education system is so broken and so divided, and nobody's really not nobody is doing something, but so much more. The ads that interrupt us over the weekend that tell us to get more credit. Surely if that was used for a smarter aim, if we were more intelligent and we thought of advertising as not interruptive, but as useful, even transformed companies could do so much. So, okay, we'll give you part of our advertising budget. How do we use it for education? Or how do we use it to further diversity? Or how do we use it to change the unfairness that is in Cape Town?
I didn't know how powerful advertising was until I started working in advertising.
Yes, yeah.
And then I realized how powerful it had been in my life. I think my first crush was this newsreader called Colin Harvey. He was an Englishman in Zimbabwe. Yeah. He had this perfectly coiffed hair, and he had this gorgeous gray and navy and black suits that he used to wear. I just think, oh my God, one day I'm going to get me a boyfriend with a side part that looks like that. Yes. And for a long time, I thought that is the standard of beauty. So probably about the first 20 years of my life, I never considered myself. Not beautiful, not ugly, just I never considered myself. And I realized when I started working in media that, oh my God, that is the power of this media, this technology. That's the power of this cultural agent called media. And I walked into those boardrooms and realized exactly why we have such violent content on our screens, especially directed at Black bodies, at women, at trans people, at gender non-conforming people, basically anyone who's not a straight white male. And so my first instinct was to laugh, because it is insane. Like, you walk into these meetings and you're like, oh my God, you were just some random dude who got here because you know someone who knows someone. Like, you're not even great. You're not even amazing. But here you are with so much power, and you don't even realize how to use it for the betterment of society. Yeah. I mean, there's that. And then there's also the fact that a lot of the people who are gatekeepers in advertising and communications are old. Like, they're old people who for a long time thought that technology was destroying humanity. But right now, ones who are rushing around Zooming and Skyping and FaceTiming at a time when we can't see each other in person as much as we would. I have this thing that I've always said with a lot of people, clients I've worked with, that everybody who says that tech is destroying humanity or that tech is influencing loneliness and so on, it's old. And not just old in age, but like old in mentality. Because the people who know tech, the people who are young at heart, who are probably also young in age too, are people who know how to infuse this and use this for their own advantage. It's not to say that no disadvantages, but it's to say that there's a lot more to be gained from it. So there's this, I think, is this coming together of like these old ideas and this violent whiteness running media, essentially, this huge cultural agent. And all of them, because they're old and because they don't get things and because they don't see outside of themselves, they see all of this cultural adjustments, dynamics happening as moments to latch onto, not as movements to commit to. And so right now you have a lot of brands stepping up and saying Black Lives Matter and saying diversity is everything. And they're just latching onto a moment. But none of them making real commitments to the movement. And the movement is about making real fundamental change to the way that we run our businesses, to the way that we live our lives. The movement requires of us to look into our better selves and to do the work that gets us to a place where we see each other as human beings across the board. And so none of them are really committing to movements. Because if they were committing to movements, they would have been listening to people years and years ago. We didn't just start now to say, please don't touch my hair, I'm not a petting zoo. We didn't start now to say, please represent our bodies in a less violent way. We didn't start now saying Blackness is not a monolith. We've been saying that for a very long time, but because they think it's cool now, they're latching onto it. And for them, it's going to be a trend that will die in a year. And then we'll go back to the same status quo of, you know, old Black women dancing for bap and like kids dancing for airtime. We'll go back there and we will carry on with the same conversations.
Yes.
And so I think the onus is on people like you and I who are putting time and money into understanding the world better for what it truly is, to kind of take over this shit and make the necessary changes to challenge people. And unfortunately, it means that we will lose friends, we will lose relatives, we will lose colleagues, we will lose money, unfortunately. And it sucks because, like, as a first generation post-colonial African country child, like, I thought that all of the sacrifices had been done. I thought all the lives had been sacrificed, and I didn't need to do that for me or the people that are coming after. Just like the general complacency of the gatekeepers in advertising and marketing will ensure that the industry stays in the same hands, but also that the industry continues to do little to nothing to advance the world.
How can white people be better allies? I mean, I know, to be honest, in our relationship, we've had struggles. There's been times that I haven't listened to you. There was a research that's just come out that white people are less trusting. The work is deep. It is foundational. It is psychological, yeah. And I say this because it is not the job of anyone of and outside of whiteness to say there's kind of like almost like an anticipation, you know, that Black must hear our problems, you know, that's how big the issue is, that there is so much kind of cognitive blindness, yeah. And it's not that I don't recognize it in myself as well. It's not that there is a divide, that there are racist people out there or bad people out there. My understanding of the human condition, and it's that beautiful thing that Solzhenitsyn says, yeah, you would cut out the evil from their own heart, because the line of kind of good and evil runs through every human heart. And I think one of the problems with whiteness is that it refuses to see itself. Yeah. And you have to. You have to walk into the darkness and the ugliness of your personal narrative. Yeah. And I think the same thing can be said about blackness, but from a xenophobic sense. Yeah. I mean, this week we saw Nigerians must go. Yeah.
I think the first departure point is always knowing that, like, even Black people are flawed. Even Black people who know shit are flawed. Even Black people who seem to have a handle on stuff, they're flawed too, because they too come from conservative families, families that are like dealing with, you know, the movement of humanity, just like any other. Homophobia is a thing we're dealing with. Xenophobia is a thing we're dealing with amongst Black families too. Like sexism is a thing. Ableism, like so many issues. So that means that, you know, I don't know. I don't have the answers. I honestly don't have the answers, because I too am trying to figure it out. So I honestly don't have the answers to how can white people be better allies. I mean, I'd say white people should Google it. Also, because the burden is not on Black people to tell white people how to be better people. I think Black women raised white children for years and years and years and have taught them so many things that those Black women's children don't need to be teaching white people how to be better people. Like the responsibility to want to be better sits on every one of us. And I think white people just need to take up the charge. I'd like to think that if, you know, one can be inventive enough to invent capitalism and racist systems like apartheid, one can definitely be inventive enough to know how to be a better ally. I just think people need to do the work. You did the work without being handheld by someone, and you continue to do the work. You continue to recognize the flaws and the goodness in yourself and in others, and you navigate that as humanly possible. White people know when they're being violent to Black people. Like when that Cooper woman in New York was phoning the cops and saying an African American man is threatening me, she knew what the hell she was doing. She knew it. So, like this damsel in distress that white men and white women and white people of non-binary gender assume is so disingenuous, and it stops us from moving forward. They know what they need to do. They know. They don't. You walk into a boardroom, you think they don't know that there is 12 of them and one Black person? They know.
It is more comfortable for white men to rule without diversity, because I've seen it.
That's one of the biggest problems with capitalism, is that unless there's money in the mix, unless there's some money to be gained at the end of it, like people in this system generally don't have a reason to try and do anything. I mean, I learned recently that one of the reasons why integration was essentially passed by the Supreme Court in America was because of commercial reasons. Somebody wanted to sell burgers to Black people too. Not because it's a good thing, not because it's the right thing to do, not because it's the human thing to do, but because there is money to be made in the mix.
My understanding of it, Larry, is that white people need to listen, and white people need to now learn to be led.
It's not so much learn to be led as much as like work towards a collaborative leadership, you know? So
I think there is a relinquishing of power. My feeling is that power has created pathologies in white people. And we see it most beautifully in Mark Zuckerberg.
But it's not a relinquishing of all power, because, you know, it's a sharing of power.
Yes.
Because, I mean, Black domination is not an option either, you know?
Yes.
if ever that's ever going to happen. I mean, I remember, I think there's a quote from Nelson Mandela where he says something like he's fought against white domination and he'll fight against black domination too, or something like that. I think we just need to share more. And this is why, like, it's so fundamentally hard in a capitalist society to talk about sharing, because it's me, 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 me. It's mine, 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 mine in this kind of space. I mean, in the most practical terms, I think white people need to listen. I think white people need to have black friends and go to black places. Like, it is the most ludicrous thing to be living in South Africa in 2020 as a white person and not have black friends. It's the most ludicrous thing to have an entire shelf of books that do not include black authors. Your colleagues, listen to them, see them. I used to work with this woman at a big PR agency, a big global PR agency. And this white woman used to greet this black woman every day for like 3 months and introduce herself. So let's say her name was Jane, and let's say the black woman's name was Loretta. Every Monday, when we're making tea in the kitchen or coffee, Jane would come in and she'd introduce herself to Loretta. Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Jane. And Loretta would be like, Jane, I know you. I've been working here for 3 years. And Jane would be like, oh, I didn't recognize you with all the hair. Did you get a new hairdo? And it would happen again the next week when Loretta's wearing a new wig or when she's got new hair. I'm telling you, it was insane. Like, it became the joke of the day. Like, all the black people would go in the kitchen in the morning when Jane was walking in, because, you know, Jane will introduce herself to Loretta again and again. And she never saw anything wrong with that. One time I wore, on a casual Friday, I wore Converse All-Stars and jeans and a shirt or something. And she's like, oh my, Larry, you look like an gent. What? Who are you?
Yeah.
I'll tell you, working in PR over the years has also taught me about the violence of white women.
Okay.
It's been a very interesting thing to see.
My personal favorite, Larry, is a journalist who once said they had an electricity outage and they were going home to their apartment to no hot water. And this journalist said, I now know what it's like to live in the townships because I won't be able to have a hot bath this evening.
Wow.
You know someone else's experience now? Really?
I laugh not because it's funny. I laugh because how the hell does one respond to this kind of nonsense? It's like, where do I even begin?
I've had someone in the advertising industry. I said I was queer and gender fluid. And this person said to me, who is the CEO of an agency, do I call you a he or do I call you a she? Or do I call you it? In that moment, the kind of a poster of Stephen King's It, you know, the clown, it like flashed in my brain. And I was so shocked.
Because then you're not human anymore, right? Yeah. As a gay man who has dated a lot of white men, some white men, those same guys who behave like that walk out and they are such closeted cases that you realize a lot of that stuff comes from the violence they're inflicting on themselves anyway. And as I'm saying this, I realize that this is also like a conditioning that a lot of other individuals in society will always do. Like, we always try and explain away the violence of people against bodies like ours because we need to make sense of it. Otherwise, it would just kill us to walk around the world without some kind of framing. I don't know if they care to know just the extent to which they hurt other human beings.
I think that people are hurt themselves, and sometimes I kind of wonder if one day we will see in the DSM, in the realms of psychology, so it's a diagnostic manual, it's called the DSM, yeah. I wonder if we will see these, we'll see these things as pathologies, and we will perhaps in the future, there will be therapy or medicine for racism, and it will be viewed as kind of a pathology, a mental illness.
Like, if there's a fight, it's to improve upon that. But part of that improvement is just to assert our own happiness and to be fully realized. Like, I've always said that other individuals, Black people, queer people, women, trans people, like people living with disabilities, people living with albinism, like other individuals, like sometimes the most political act that we could do in our lifetime is to live a full life.
I refuse to work with cisgendered men who no longer give me visibility. I refuse to communicate with them. I don't hurt them. It's not for me to tell other people how to live or how to be. They must sort out themselves. It's not my job. So I have actively ended relationships like that. Yeah, I said, I'm sorry, I can't work with you. And I have not even explained it because it is not my job to explain it. I kind of move on because it's painful. Yeah. And so I end the pain and I move on.
It's not the job of the oppressed to teach the oppressor how to stop oppressing them. It really isn't. It's not the job of the queer people to teach heteronormative people that we are human too. It's not the job of Black people to teach white people that we deserve respect and that we're human too. Because when they inflict that pain on us, when they inflict that hurt, they know exactly what they're doing. They do. They may choose not to, they may choose to ignore it, but they definitely know exactly what they're doing. When that guy said, should I call you a he or a she or an it, he knew exactly what he was doing, because that does not come from a place of love. And then that guy goes into a brainstorm session and he leads a brainstorm session for an LGBTQIA plus brand that is supposed to be speaking to people like you and I. And at the end, all you get is a Toyota party at Pride. That's it. That's what that guy gave you, a big party.
And I see it again in the startup, particularly in the Cape startup world, that there are bands of friends who come from very wealthy family, and they enable and embolden each other and create enclaves of whiteness. Yeah.
I wish white people, generally, knew that whiteness is violent. I really wish that they saw the tragedy of whiteness.
Mm.
And the problem I've found is that the moment you say whiteness, people conflate it with being white. They think that being white is whiteness, and then that conversation generally just spirals out of control. But I wish people, and I suppose for people to see the violence in whiteness, they need to kind of see the whiteness in their own existence. And then it means they need to see themselves. And they generally don't want to do that. Because again, for them to see themselves and to see the truth does not make them warm at night, does not make them sleep better at night.
More so, Larry, that the experience of whiteness can be an experience of neurosis and narcissism. We need to be brave enough to kind of put this toxic success culture on the table and failed white masculinity on the table. And we need to talk about it. We need to have courageous conversations, because only when you admit that there are problems. And I know, because I've worked in big organizations and I have cultivated kind of a PTSD, and I have cultivated kind of like insecurities. It came from my white upbringing. And I have been in therapy to kind of reform that and to rebuild my sense of self. So I can attest that whiteness is very damaging. And that's what many white people sit with, yeah. And they refuse to acknowledge that. And then they, on the other hand, the absolute blindness and the invisibility. So there is so much work to do.
And hopefully, and I know hope is not a strategy, but hopefully those conversations permeate from our private spaces into our businesses, because then we start to transform the agents of culture that our businesses run. Then advertising starts to look different. Then, the face of the people who own the businesses starts to look different, at least in South Africa.
The one thing I do know is kind of the hope of the Black Lives Movement and kind of what is being done to change perceptions around Blackness. And there is hope in unity, that unity in a unification through identity, like Black Lives Matter. When I watch what is being achieved by that organization, I find it phenomenal in terms of changing perceptions and changing white perceptions. They are doing a lot to change, and I see organizations like McKinsey changing their structure, and I see organizations saying, no, this kind of white leadership that we've done, it's not right anymore. We've got to change it.
My experience of the Black Lives Matter movement here locally, especially amongst like middle class, upper middle class, Black and white people, is that a lot of white people don't think that we have that kind of race problem here. So Black Lives Matter is so far removed from them because it's American, because we don't have that kind of race problem here. So there's firstly that faulty way of looking at it. And being one of the only one Black friend that people have, I have been on the hard end of like listening to people essentially share their walk to enlightenment, which is generally usually flawed, listening to people justify some of their bigotry. And for a long time, I thought that my career depended on being nice to that kind of engagement. And so my response had always been, to placate and to make sure that they feel comfortable. And lately I have just felt like actually I don't need to anymore. And I'm unlearning this thing of trying to always go out of my way to make white people comfortable. But the other end of the stick is that a lot of these white people that I engage around who are largely middle and upper middle class, that when they realize how less I care about their comfort, the fragility steps in, and I am militant, or I'm confrontational, or I'm radical. And I don't know how I'm going to deal with it when it comes through, but I've had one or two incidents where I've lost some friends because of that. And because I've just stopped giving a shit about making them comfortable at my own expense. The emotional work and the emotional labor that comes with like thinking a sentence 5 times before saying it to make sure that Karen, and Karen is a stand-in for any white person, to make sure that Karen is comfortable, or doesn't feel threatened, or doesn't feel like I'm smarter than them, or doesn't feel like I'm better than them, is insane. Like the amount of emotional work that takes is insane. And the jokes, there's the jokes that make Blackness the butt end of the joke. The jokes that make gayness the end of the joke. Yeah, this is also like something I've been teaching myself to unlearn. Stop laughing at those stupid jokes, because they're not jokes, they're not funny. And for a long time I had been laughing because I felt that my life depended on it. And for some, in some way it maybe had, but I don't have to do that at all.
You remind me so much of what James Baldwin meant when he said, perhaps home is not a place, but simply an irrevocable condition.
it took me, when I was 23, this guy who lived in the UK, and we met on Gaydar because gay people have been using the internet for a very long time to date. And I was in Zimbabwe then. We met on Gaydar, and I think I was 22 actually, 22. And he came to Zim, and we had been corresponding for about 3-4 weeks before he came, and he was just the loveliest man. He sounded lovely. He was a cello player, and he lectured music. And I say to him, I'll get you a gift to take back to the UK. He was born in Bulawayo and had lived in the UK then. And when I found his picture frames that were made of railway slippers from old Rhodesia. And so like they had a little piece of like when he was born and so on. And he brought me Giovanni's Room, which is exact copy.
Oh my love.
This exact copy. I've had this copy. And he brought me this book, and I framed it. This is how meaningful it was for me. And we had a whirlwind romance for like the week that he was there. It was fantastic. And I read this book. I was like, who is this guy? Who is this man I've never met, but my God is writing about my life and the world I live in. It almost felt like he came out of history and like gave me a hug at a time when I was trying to form myself and I was learning who I was. Like, it felt like James Baldwin himself came out of the archives of history and just hugged me and told me that everything was okay. And then I was like, oh, wow. This is my ancestor. It's the only way it could make sense to me.
Yeah.
And it was around about that time that I just started looking for other ancestors, like other people who came before me, who tried to make life better for people that look like me, that are like me. And so, like the way that James Baldwin talks about the human condition, and this was the 80s, the way he spoke about gender in the 70s, way before we even could think about gender as a construct, it's the most beautiful thing and also just the most moving thing I have ever engaged. And so I have words from James Baldwin tattooed on my thigh. You have to go the way your blood beats. If you don't, you won't live some other life. You won't live any life at all. And that's kind of my mantra through it all. So James Baldwin is my ancestor, along with so many other Black and queer people who came before me and tried to make sure that the world saw us and respected us. And so walking into advertising and knowing that I'm up against so much and that many other people like me are up against so much, like I know that, like Maya Angelou says, even though I come and I'm standing in front of everybody alone, I am with multitudes, because so much has been done to make sure that I could live the best life I possibly could.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you.
This has been really lovely.
Take care, my darling friend.
You too, Charlie. Take care.